Night. The girl sitting on the bed, looking at her hands, not realizing what had happened. Placing her hand on the bed, she finds that the sheet is too stiff. Upon taking a better look, she discovers Archduke Glenn beneath her. Moonlight falls on his beautiful sleeping face. She can't take her eyes off him. A half-naked man with his hands bound lies directly below her. Upon realizing this, the girl is startled and blushes. She can't believe this is happening in real life. In her half-fainting state, it seemed crazy to her. She wondered what she had done, blaming herself for Vivian Lewis going crazy. The girl assumed she had kidnapped the Archduke. She was only 14 when the Archduke caught her eye. It was at a debutante ball, a place brimming with the hopes and dreams of the young and noble. Vivian hoped to meet a handsome young man and begin a romantic relationship. Archduke Glenn entered the ballroom. The ladies admired his beauty. He walked down the long steps toward the guests. Lennox Elpidian Glenn. He was 18 at the time. At 17, he inherited the title, and the attitudes of those around him changed accordingly. He shone like a diamond. It was then that Vivian fell in love with him. She's the kind of person who falls in love easily. Her heart fluttered at the mere sight of him. Thus began 7 years of her fanaticism. It pleased the girl that she was good at drawing. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been able to capture every moment with the Archduke. It was the only way she could secretly admire him without anyone knowing, except for her family members and loved ones. Vivian thought if she hired an artist to paint 10,000 pictures, he'd probably think she was crazy. Her room was full of pictures of Glenn, pillows with his face on them. She thought it was beautiful and wanted to live forever admiring it and not marry. She was squeezing her pillow and saying how she didn't want to get married. The lady behind her asked. She was thinking about it again. Vivian turned around and saw Marina. She rushed to hug her. Marina asked how long the girl was going to admire the Archduke. She replied that dreaming about him makes her happy. Delightedly sharing her feelings, she described the joy of making paintings with the Archduke and inventing love stories. Marina expressed concern about the girl's future loneliness because of these fantasies. Vivian resented it. She will never be alone. She has a younger brother, Kasian. Marina wondered if Kasian had never looked at her with compassion. Marina stroked Vivian's head soothingly. She had somewhere to go, so she asked her to take care of it and gave her her shoulder bag. Vivian asked what it was. The girl warned her that it was her stuff and it was dangerous, so she wasn't allowed to open the bag. Having said that, she said goodbye and left, promising to return soon. Marina has magic. She's studying at the academy in the capital of the empire. Since her hometown is too far away from her studies, she visits us, feeling indebted to them. Vivian placed her bag on the couch and sat down, looking at an album filled with drawings of the Archduke. She really wanted to look in the bag, especially after being forbidden to do so. The girl thought nothing would happen if she caught a glimpse, so she decided to just look and close it right away. Marina had never shown her anything dangerous. She supposed it was because Vivian was like a little sister to her. Closing the album, she headed for her bag, wondering until when Marina would see her as a child. The girl took the bag in her hands, thinking she would just look in and put it back. Suddenly, the album falls, and some of the drawings are damaged and scattered around the room. With tears in her eyes, she swept the floor, asking her creatures forgiveness for failing to protect them. She would be embarrassed to call in the maids after she'd made this whole mess. As she sits down on the floor, putting the album together, she notices a large black ball on the floor. She took it in her hands and looked at her reflection. Deciding to put it in her bag, she headed towards it, but tripped and dropped the balloon, shattering it. She looked at the shards with tears in her eyes, not knowing what to do, because it was Marina's thing. Vivian only had memories before the orb appeared. Now, she sat on the floor in front of the bed with Glenn tied up, and thought it would be best not to open Marina's bag. She was called out by the waking Archduke. He asked why she shouldn't finish what she had started, further causing her to be perplexed by what was happening. Glenn looked directly at her and said flirtatiously that he would have preferred Lady Vivian to continue what she had started. The girl was very embarrassed by his desire. She thought she had kidnapped the Archduke, continuing to wonder how he could be so calm. Vivian couldn't believe that someone like her could kidnap a sword master and tie him to a bed. It was unthinkable. How dare she kidnap his person? In her imagination, he should have grabbed a sword and pounced on Vivian in a rage, threatening to massacre the kidnapper. The Archduke turned to the girl again. He asked why Lady Vivian was so upset. He acted like it was no big deal. Sitting on the floor in front of the bed, the confused girl still could not believe that at the age of 21 she could kidnap the Archduke. She was sure the officers would rush in immediately. Vivian thought fearfully that everyone would see her room full of the Archduke's drawings and be horrified. Her hobby will be judged, considered creepy to the point of creepiness. Glenn tried to reassure the girl and offered to come closer. She perked up, apologizing. Vivian offered to untie her hands. The Archduke calmed her down and told her it was all right. Rushing to untie her hands, Vivian blamed herself for tying her lover's hands too tightly. She couldn't believe she had damaged the Archduke's body. The girl began to look at Glenn's hands, having thought them very handsome. But now there were rope marks on his wrists. Her eyes filled with tears as she reproached herself more and more for what had happened. He took her by the arm with one hand, and with the other he put his arm around her head and reassured her. Said he was fine, and the wound was nothing to him. Vivian excitedly asked him if he knew he was kidnapped and the kidnapper was her. In response, the Archduke admitted that he enjoyed being tied up and turns out bound. People are to the girl's taste. The girl looked at Glenn and couldn't believe why he was still so affectionate with her when they hadn't even interacted before. The thought flashed through her mind that he'd gone crazy with the kidnapping. Frightened, she decided to make sure the Archduke was okay. Vivian held out the middle finger of her hand to him and wondered how many fingers he could see. He replied that the finger was one. Then Vivian asked the Archduke's full name, to which she heard Lennox Elpidian Glenn. She noted that he still seemed to be in his right mind. Vivian couldn't understand why he was so gentle with her. Was it his imagination playing tricks on him, or was he really enjoying the situation? Glenn sat across the table and turned to the girl, calling her name. The girl withdrew, trembling with excitement. And then he said, as if he'd heard that she wanted intimacy with him. Vivian, stammering with excitement, tried to resist him. Then the Archduke approached her. Vivian squirmed on the bed, and he said he had heard that she had wanted to do this from the moment she first saw him. Glenn gently took her hand, leaned over, and touched his lips to her palm. Vivian froze with excitement. Her heart at this moment fluttered more than ever. Was this all really happening to her? He held her hand. Worried, Vivian couldn't get over what was happening, if this was all real and he had really kissed her palm. The Archduke was so close, it seemed like a girl's lifelong dream had come true. If it weren't for one fact, they were both in Vivian's room, full of paintings and things that screamed of her fanatical inclination toward Glenn. And so the truth she had hidden for so long was revealed, the fact that she's been a fan of the Archduke for 7 whole years. They were sitting on a bed in a room full of pictures, toys, and even a pillow with Glenn's picture on it. A thought crept into Vivian's head, wondering if she was in the tiger's den. It was only her bedroom, but the problem was that the Archduke she had captured was here. Vivian was very concerned about what Glenn thought when he saw the room decorated with his portraits. She assumed something along the lines of, "I've been stolen by a very real stalker." Then the Archduke is stalling now because he's waiting for the kidnapper's demands. So the girl turned to the man, explaining that it was a misunderstanding. But what she was going to do to him, no matter which way you looked at it, was shameless. Tied up and tried. She didn't know how to explain to him that she hadn't done everything on purpose. She just liked watching him from the sidelines. It was enough that he would remember her as the once sweet girl who greeted him. But she thought she had ended up being a shameless kidnapper. Vivian wondered if she should find some excuse. It's pointless, however, but it's better than sitting in silence. Glenn was at this time squeezing a pillow with his image on it. The girl distracted him by telling him that his kidnapping was unplanned. It's a mistake. She told me that a strange black bead had recently fallen out of her hand and shattered. Vivian wondered what the bead was after all. Because of her obsession with the Archduke, she never had relationships with other men. Until she was 16, the hope of mutual affection still smoldered in her breast. But as she got older, she realized the harsh reality of what was happening. A girl from a poor family should never be near an Archduke. But somewhere deep inside, she wished she could kidnap him. Did the black bead only expose her lust? If so, upon finding out, the parents and Kasian will be shocked. She waited for him to say something. Glenn said she understood. She broke the strange black bead left by her wizard friend and was enveloped in smoke. Afterwards, she remembered nothing, and when she regained consciousness, she realized that she had kidnapped him. The girl exclaimed joyfully that that was exactly what it was. Looking at him, Vivian thought that although it was dark at night, she was dazzled by the Archduke's insane beauty. She hoped it was resolved now. Glenn asked if she really thought he would believe that. The girl tensed. He continued by saying that she kidnapped him and made up such a ridiculous story. In a panic, the girl screamed, insisting she was right. She was afraid that if the throngs of his female fans found out she'd stolen it, they wouldn't just stigmatize her socially, they'd put her in jail. She couldn't let that happen. Marrying the Archduke was no longer her goal. She just wanted to live her life as his groupie. A normal, happy life like everyone else, that's enough. It started with a few paintings, and then she was unstoppable and his portraits filled the room. The Archduke has never harmed anyone. Vivian really wanted to go back in time and not touch Marina's bag. Tears streamed down the girl's face. Glenn gently touched her cheek, wiping the tears from her face. The man put his arm around her and pulled her close, telling her that she was very kind. Vivian asked why the Archduke was so gentle. She started up the speech again about how it was all the Blackbeard's fault. Glenn stroked the girl's head and soothingly agreed. Vivian turned around, wondering if he liked the situation. The man, covering his bare chest, began to deny it, saying he's scared to death because Vivian stole it. The girl insisted that it wasn't kidnapping, but misuse of magical tools. An accident. Vivian thought how much he pissed her off. Had he always had this temper? But it's beautiful. Oh, that sinful beauty. Glenn asked what they would do after all, emphasizing that soon his knights would be here and she would have to go to jail. The girl clutched her head in horror, screaming that it was terrible. The man took her hand, asking her not to pull out such marvelous hair. He offered a way out of this difficult situation. He took her hands and knelt before her, telling her that she could be his mistress. The girl was surprised at this option to solve the problem. She thought he was crazy, but his eyes were beautiful. She asked if the Archduke was really proposing that she become his mistress, to which she received an affirmative answer. He leaned his head against her lap, secretly wishing she was his bride. She felt that such a suggestion was only appropriate after the young people had been dating for a while. She was embarrassed. The Archduke is a great nobleman of the Elfadar Empire, a powerful man who controls half of the entire country. One who possesses wealth and power comparable to that of the emperor cannot marry the daughter of a little-known count. In addition, there are rumors that the Archduke is about to enter into a political marriage with a princess of another state. Accordingly, only she will be his lawfully wedded wife. She came to the conclusion that they would hang out for a while and then drift apart. Glenn asked if she agreed. The girl faltered. He knows full well that she has no other choice to explain the kidnapping situation. The phrase, "we're in a relationship," works best. It dawned on Vivian. Perhaps Marina would be able to prove her innocence when she told her about the black bead. But she is not from a powerful family, so there is a high probability that Marina's testimony will not be considered. Then there's only one way out. Vivian said firmly. She would become the Archduke's mistress, however, on the condition of a love contract. She thought she couldn't help but thank herself for this brilliant idea. If they sign a contract, they can establish how long their relationship will last, how it will break down, and how far it can go. She didn't think the Archduke would want anything more than kisses, but who knows? She couldn't vouch for herself either. He's too attractive. Maybe he has a cunning plan. Glenn pulled himself up, looking at the girl sadly, then nuzzled into her lap again and asked if the love contract meant Lady Vivian wasn't going to seriously date him. It was the first time she had spoken to the Archduke for so long, and she didn't realize what kind of close relationship she could be talking about. After all, she was the one who kidnapped him. Glenn asked how long Vivian would like to contract for. She was confused as she didn't know how long they were usually contracted for, months or years, and suggested a 6-month contract. The Archduke was upset as to why 6 months. Vivian thought that was too much and reduced the time frame to 4 months. This angered him even more. Then Vivian apologized, deciding to offer 2 months. She didn't know how much she should have said, assuming he didn't like the idea of a contract, but after all, he was the one who'd offered to be his mistress. The girl thought she had misunderstood something. Maybe he doesn't want a contractual relationship. Glenn took the girl's hand and named a 1-year time limit. Vivian opened her mouth in surprise. He smiled, looking into her eyes and waiting for a response. Vivian lowered her head sadly, thinking this was taking too long. And then Glenn said, even though he felt like it wouldn't be enough. And the girl immediately agreed to a 1-year contract. The man asked to say his vows. She glanced at him, wondering if it was really that important. His face was serious, and she exhaled. Raising one hand, Vivian said, she, Vivian Lewis, swears, making a contract with the Grand Archduke Lennox Glenn for a term of 1 year. Glenn raised his hand and said the same oath at the same time as Vivian. The girl thought, they make a vow that they will dish out contract love. Is it normal? It looks like blasphemy. The Archduke patted the girl on the head, saying what a good girl she was. Blushing, she asked why he was suddenly speaking in a formal speech. He bowed, emphasizing the fact that they were now in an official relationship, so from now on he would address her respectfully. She was very uncomfortable. She had picked up on how thoughtful he was. Glenn agreed, calling the girl his sweet Vivian, which made her cheeks blush even more. She assumed it was all she'd heard. Vivian waved a hand in front of him, assuming the Archduke had hit his head while she was stealing him away. She was embarrassed by his presence in her room full of portraits of the Archduke. She thought it would be best to get Glenn out of here. Deciding to give an unobtrusive hint, the girl asked what they should do. Emphasizing that it was a rather long night, she thought it would be better for the man to go home. Glenn asked what he was going to do out there alone. He touched her face, asking if it would be best to continue what he had started. The girl was startled. She had absolutely no recollection of what they had been doing. The man emphasized that he was nearly naked, insinuating that it wasn't him who took off his clothes. After hesitating, he corrected his words, saying that his clothes had not been removed but torn to shreds, pointing a finger at the remains of his shirt on the floor. The girl crouched down in panic, holding her head. She couldn't believe she could do such a thing, but there was no one else in the room besides them. The man put his hand on Vivian's shoulders, saying that a little more, and she would be so completely hairless, though he had to admit that even for such an activity, she looked adorable. These words encouraged Vivian. Looking at the Archduke, she happily said that he too, even if he were bald, would still look beautiful. He thanked her, assuring her that the tattered things weren't worth her worry. He took her hands in his, saying, after all, the important thing was that Vivian wanted it. She kept thinking, and couldn't understand why Glenn was so kind. He used to look like an ice sculpture, and even had the nickname Ice Nobleman. Her peers really liked that type. The Archduke she knew rarely smiled, and he wasn't friendly at all. She wondered if it was okay to be his girlfriend, even though they had a contract. The Archduke is so favorable to her. Maybe it's Marina's magical thing. And all the sudden outbursts of emotion were influenced by the bead. The thought kept her on her toes. Vivian turned to the Archduke, and he assumed the girl had figured out what they would do next. And with a radiant smile and a twinkle in his eye, he looked at her. The girl shivered, saying she was about something else. It wasn't the piano playing that the Archduke was alluding to, she thought, and felt very uncomfortable with the rapid progression of their relationship. A little miffed, she asked what he was thinking when he first saw her room. The girl nervously clutched the hem of her nightgown. Glenn looked around and thought silently. The hanging pause made her even more uncomfortable. The man finally spoke, he thought, really liking Vivian. He sat on the floor next to her and chuckled cutely. She was surprised he wasn't hurt by what he saw. She thought she was lucky he wasn't angry, but that reaction was odd. Vivian shook her head, trying not to get herself worked up. Glenn asked what was bothering her. The girl asked how far their love contract would go. The Archduke asked in reply what she wished. Vivian suggested that a hug should be enough. Seeing Glenn's serious face, she panicked, suggesting that they just hold hands because a hug was too close. The man asked why it was too close. Vivian reminded of the fact that it is only a contract. Glenn gently took her hand, telling her that although it was a contract, they were now in a relationship. Her cheeks turned pink. He stroked her hair, saying hugs, kisses, and everything else. Vivian, as if mesmerized, repeated his last words. The Archduke slid his hand to her lips. Vivian thought it was dangerous to go any farther, since they were still officially free, and she hesitantly said there were rumors of his wedding. Glenn inquired with whom. Since the Archduke is from the upper classes, a marriage of convenience does not raise any questions for him. Aristocrats often marry out of love for the welfare of their family. This includes her parents, Marina's parents, even her brother Kasian. Since the Archduke is a famous nobleman, he is forced to marry the princess. Since the Duke's mother was royalty, he has the right to marry someone from the ruling dynasty. Vivian thought she was saying some pretty obvious things, so why wouldn't the Archduke understand her? He hugged the girl tightly. Glenn looked into Vivian's eyes. He was so close that the girl almost fainted. He slid his hand down her neck, resting it on her shoulder, and asked if he could kiss her. The girl panicked. Glenn's eyes lit up and he said first they would kiss, then move on and someday get married. Vivian's eye was already twitching. She didn't know what she should do. Perhaps she should hit the Archduke to make him come to his senses. While she was thinking, Glenn touched her neck and kissed her gently. Vivian was very surprised. She was kissing the Archduke himself, and it was not just a peck on the lips, but a real kiss. Like they're a real couple. The thought popped into Vivian's head that someone might see them, and she began to resist. Her resistance made her short of breath, and Glenn ended the kiss, saying she has to breathe when she kisses. She felt embarrassed. The Archduke laughed and, stroking her head, kissed the girl on the forehead. He inquired how long she had liked him. The girl blanched. She couldn't tell the Archduke that she had been following him for 7 years. Something like that would raise too many questions. He asked if she had strong feelings for him. Vivian, after thinking for a moment, replied, "The Archduke looks like something unattainable." Initially, the Archduke was the first innocent crush, and now she trembles at just a brief glimpse of him. He is like a distant star shining in the sky. But to speak of a serious relationship in her and the Archduke's situation makes no sense. After all, in a year they'll be parted like ships at sea. It's like nothing ever happened. She tried to convince herself not to believe this fairy tale situation seriously. Glenn hoped Vivian would be comfortable around him. Having said that, he kissed her hand gently. He looked at her happily, saying that now it was okay to tell her parents that they were officially dating. She wondered if their relationship felt like an official one. There was a noise outside. The girl ran to the window in a panic. Pulling back the curtains, she saw men with torches. Looking closer, Vivian considered the coat of arms of Archduke Glenn. The Archduke looked out of the window and said, "Here come the knights, praising their efforts, for they had almost found him." Vivian panicked. This was no time for jokes. She ran around the room looking for a shirt. The idea of borrowing Kasian's clothes crossed her mind. Heading for the exit, she asked the Archduke to wait for her here. Glenn took a seat on the bed and gave her a cute little smile. In the dressing room, Vivian tried to find a shirt as soon as possible. Grabbing the right one, she assumed she had taken her father's shirt. But there was no time, so she took it to her room. Servants could be heard talking in the hallway, and Vivian froze. They were discussing the theft of the Archduke, and the fact that there was a witness who had seen a thief with the same hair as the mistress. She rushed into the room. Vivian burst into the room and was relieved to see the Archduke alone there. He poured water into a glass and held it out to her, offering her a drink. The girl grabbed the glass and drank in a volley, handing over her shirt. Glenn put the shirt on, complimenting how well it fit and how soft it was. The man thanked Vivian. It was very embarrassing for her to receive a thank you, knowing that she had torn it up herself. A butler knocked on the door. "It's time." Vivian thought since she and the Archduke were in a relationship, the situation would no longer seem strange. She decided to explain that she hadn't kidnapped him, just brought him to her room, though that option didn't seem like the best one to her. After all, they're not even engaged, and she dragged the Archduke into her bedroom. After this, her reputation will be ruined. She thought at the end of her contract she would meet a normal person and finally get married. However, if nothing is done now, you'll have to live the rest of your life with your parents. Whether she can accomplish anything through self-education. Vivian is good at drawing and writing. Perhaps she could become a story writer. That's not a bad thing. The butler under the door insisted she open it. Glenn asked if she was ready. The girl answered decisively in the affirmative. He leaned over to her and said he was sure she would soon get used to everything. Vivian laughed nervously. She felt like she was walking through a minefield. If she hadn't kidnapped the Archduke, she could have lived a normal life. The man kissed her cheek, trying to reassure her. They held hands. For Vivian, those touches felt like the first time every time. After all, it wasn't that long ago that they were kissing. The girl grabbed the Archduke and dragged. She was sure the butler would be shocked. Because of his many responsibilities, he earned indigestion and lost some of his hair. She touched the doorknob, mentally apologizing to the butler. Opening the door, he shrieked that the lady had become a criminal. Vivian denied everything, trying to explain the situation. She said that the Archduke was in her room as they were having a secret rendezvous. The butler, wiping the tears from his face, said as he now looked into the eyes of the lord and lady, emphasizing how Miss wised up. He was heartbroken. Vivian was worried, of course, he could be understood. She had previously been completely out of touch with the Archduke, and then she suddenly announced that they were now dating. Anyone would have suspected something wrong. But it's true, even though they have a contract. Vivian grabbed the butler by the shoulders, reassuring him that their relationship was real. She wasn't crazy. The man said in a trembling voice that he believed Vivian. But what about those wedding rumors? Wasn't Miss going to get married this year? The girl awkwardly looked away, saying that she was only pondering it for now. Butler said he'd already sent their portraits. Good thing it's only been a week since these rumors spread. Vivian asked what rumors we were talking about. The butler replied that it was about the wedding, and that a wealthy man had taken a fancy to her. There was a crunch. The Archduke's doorknob broke in his hands. Vivian and the butler looked at him in surprise. He only smiled, emphasizing how flimsy the handle was. Vivian wondered if it wasn't made of gilded steel. Plus, the handle had screws in it. How did he even manage to break it? Perhaps it's because of the swordmaster's strength. She remembered Cassian saying that all swordsmen were monsters. Then what he says is true. Somehow now she was intimidated by her relationship with the Archduke, and, she said, well, they'll break up in a year. Glenn, barely concealing his anger, asked if Vivian had said anything. The girl hesitated, then asked, she and he would end their relationship after a year, wouldn't they? The Archduke, smiling, replied that he was not sure of that. Vivian was very excited by his answer. He approached her, asking for an apology. He said he didn't recall such an agreement. The girl panicked. She didn't know what to do if he pretended not to know about the contract term. She shouted, if the Archduke didn't keep his promise, there could be trouble. She asked if they were in a relationship. He only stared at her silently with an enigmatic smile. Vivian touched his hand. He was leaving her no choice. It's FaceTime, which Vivian uses when she needs something from her brother or parents. She begged the Archduke to tell her if they were a couple. The Archduke laughed, covering his eyes. The girl didn't understand his reaction. Snickering, she wondered if he was only playing with her feelings. So the Archduke was faking it all along. Or perhaps it was the sight of her that made him laugh. Cassian also smiles when Vivian asks for something, but he never once laughs. The Archduke asked her who she was to him. She assumed the Archduke's girlfriend. The man smiled happily, saying, let it be for starters. Vivian was surprised by that to begin with. She assumed the Archduke meant that depending on her actions, he would treat her either as a kidnapper or as a girl. She had to remain a girl in his memories at all costs. She screamed, thank you. The Archduke laughed even harder. Vivian asked why he was laughing all the time. She had a feeling he was teasing her. Turning around, she said she thought the butler was completely clueless as to what they were just talking about. Vivian emphasized that she'd better get outside before the shouting got even louder outside the window. The Archduke's knights looked intimidating, but Vivian was sure her family had good warriors, too. We need to clarify things before it gets to a confrontation. She took the Archduke's hand and shouted decisively that they had to go. Glenn spoke up. He had something to say to Vivian. He turned her toward him, telling her that she was more than just a girl to him. He wanted it to be known to her. She was very embarrassed. The girl thought the Archduke was implying that she was also a hijacker. Going down the stairs to the bottom of the stairs, they opened the doors and stepped outside. They were greeted by anxious parents and Cassian. Vivian tried to explain the situation, saying that she and the Archduke were actually... But she was interrupted by condemning shouts. The warriors felt they had been duped, and there was a whiff of treason here. The girl panicked. This was a real disaster. Something had to be said immediately. She turned to the Archduke, pathetically demanding that they explain everything. Glenn agreed with her. Smiling happily, he took her in his arms, saying that now no one would think she had kidnapped him. Vivian had a feeling they were going to kidnap her already. She was very embarrassed. The Archduke was so close. But the important thing now is to resolve this situation. The knights were shocked when they saw His Highness Lennox heading towards them with Vivian in his arms. The Vivian family warriors only looked questioningly at the lady. She waved awkwardly at them. The warriors assumed that the girl had stolen the Archduke with the help of black magic. She resented the suggestion. In the entire empire, only a few mages who have received the Crown Prince's permission are allowed to use black sorcery. If it turns out she had anything to do with him, Vivian and her family will be executed immediately. She screamed. How could she use black magic? She was completely clueless about it. She doesn't even have the strength to swordsmanship, let alone use any magic. Listening to the mistress, the warriors sighed awkwardly. The warrior, turning to the knights, said it was true. Miss had long ago abandoned sorcery. She found it quite difficult. And in the direction of the sword lady did not even look, because from fencing can appear blisters. She doesn't have any superpowers. Miss and very cute, but nature didn't endow her with any talents. The knight gripped the hilt of his sword, asking what about the testimony of their witness who claimed their lady had kidnapped His Highness. The warrior suggested that the man might have been lying. The Archduke intervened in the conversation, saying he would explain everything. Glenn said emphatically, "Vivian Lewis is his girlfriend." Saying that, he turned around and walked away. The knights couldn't believe their ears. Vivian's father called out to His Highness, asking what he had just said. The Archduke repeated, "His daughter is the person he loves." The knight drew his sword and pointed it at them. Glenn asked if Lord Royd was bored with life. The man shouted that His Highness was out of his mind. "He's sure that witch bewitched him." The Archduke asked coldly if he had heard correctly that the man had called his girlfriend a witch. Is he willing to be held accountable for his words? Vivian thought that for knights, bearing responsibility as she knew it meant parting with one's life. The Archduke continued, asking if the knight's life was so inexpensive. The knight trembled. He dropped his sword and fell to his knees. Glenn said that when they returned, he would come up with a punishment for this unseemly behavior. He ordered the knight to raise his sword and step back. Everyone present began to discuss their relationship. They believed they were a couple after all. The knights were saying, what about Princess Eunice then? After all, they were a successful union. Someone objected, arguing that it was no longer their problem to solve, but His Highness. Eunice is a princess of the southern country of Evron, first heir to the throne. Vivian assumed that she herself had proposed to the Archduke. This wedding would be very beneficial to the Empire and to the Archduke himself. Vivian stopped those thoughts. She should have been glad she hadn't been accused of kidnapping. She thought she was very lucky. When else would she be able to draw such a lucky ticket? Glenn asked what she was thinking about. Vivian blanched, saying she would tell when they were alone. The Archduke said it could be arranged right away. He knew he still had to explain everything to Vivian's family and his knights. How burdensome the title of Archduke is. Instead of all that, he wished he were in the same bed as Vivian right now. The girl was very embarrassed. The knights looked at the pair, and one of them cried out, "If they had seen this madness!" Mr. Lennox laughed. This was the first time they had seen such behavior from an Archduke. It seemed like they were going to have nightmares tonight, for the devil himself has emerged from the depths of hell and bared his teeth. Putting Vivian down, the Archduke stood before the knights, asking, despite all the difficulties, they had decided to break into the Count's house after all. The knights bowed and apologized for what they had done. After talking to the knights, Glenn turned to Vivian, now needing to discuss things with her family. She happily agreed, and Glenn smiled at her. The girl blushed, thinking his smile was like a blossoming spring flower. It was chilly outside, and she was shivering, worrying if the Archduke would freeze in just a shirt. Noticing Vivian shivering, the man asked if she was cold. The girl denied it, and Glenn put his arm around her. Vivian blushed. She was very uncomfortable. He said she should get used to it. Their tender embrace was watched by the entire Vivian family. The father, unable to bear it, called out to the Archduke. Having said that, they have so much to discuss. It's not proper to keep a guest outside. My father offered to come inside. The Archduke bowed to the Count, thanking him. Sitting by the fireplace, his father asked His Highness if he would continue to sit like this. In the Archduke's lap sat Vivian. Vivian, realizing the shamelessness of the situation, made an attempt to escape, but Glenn held her by the waist and sat her back down. The Archduke begged to be forgiven, but he didn't want to part with Vivian for a moment. The girl resented his behavior. She thought he didn't need to play the loving boyfriend so diligently. It was just a contract. In the future, he will still marry Princess Eunice. His smile looked just like Cassian's when he teases her. She climbed off the Archduke resentfully and crouched down beside him. There was an awkward pause. My father suggested that we continue the conversation. Glenn agreed, naming his father Earl Louis. Vivian noticed that her father liked it when the Archduke addressed him that way. His mother offered the Archduke warm tea to keep him warm. Cassian knew that the Archduke was a swordsman. That's why he was more shocked than anyone else. Vivian thought he looked foolish. She wanted to draw it now and then mock it for the rest of her life. His father remarked that the shirt His Highness was wearing was his favorite. Glenn apologized, saying he had nothing to wear. He'll ask for his shirt to be thoroughly washed and he'll bring it back. And as an apology, he'll send 100 more of them. The Count flustered, stopping the Archduke. He was just uncomfortable. Vivian admired the Archduke with embarrassment. She thought that even when merely drinking tea, the Archduke was incredibly charming. The Count asked if His Highness was in a serious relationship with his daughter. The Archduke replied in all earnestness that it was true, though only a week had passed, that his feelings for her were sincere. Things were going unexpectedly smoothly. Vivian was uncomfortable. Cassian asked what His Highness liked so much about his sister. Vivian resented the question. The Archduke hesitated. She looked at him, hoping he would come up with something plausible. Finally, Glenn said, "Vivian is very nice. She has cute round eyes. She also blushes funny when she's embarrassed. And if he asks for something, he makes a childish face. So everywhere you look, you're cute." He asked with a completely innocent look if the older brother didn't think his little sister was adorable. Cassian replied that he wasn't crazy yet. Interrupting Cassian's flattering speech, his mother kicked him in the side, and the brother smiled, correcting himself, meaning his sister is so beautiful he's about to lose his mind. After tea, the Archduke and Vivian went outside. The man said he had a great time today. Tomorrow morning he will send her a letter and a gift, Vivian wondered. Glenn assured her that it was the foundation of the relationship. This scared her even more. She had no idea how to act because this was her first relationship. Vivian pouted, thinking that she would definitely need to consult Marina. She wondered why she still hadn't returned. Glenn turned the girl toward him and kissed her cheek. The Archduke smiled, saying it was a goodbye kiss, wishing Vivian a good night. The girl, too, wished the Archduke good night and went to her room. While in her room, Vivian jokingly punched a pillow with Glenn's picture on it, so she decided to get back at him for the sudden kiss. Afterwards, he hugged her and apologized with a mock apology. The girl was still outraged by the Archduke's behavior. She lay back on the bed and thought about it. She found it odd that in the time that had passed since the kidnapping, an imperial investigator would have obviously had time to arrive, meaning the Knights hadn't reported it to the search department. Hugging the pillow with Glenn's picture on it tightly, Vivian breathed in his scent that still lingered in the room. She still couldn't believe this was really happening, and she was dating him. The Knights were beating up Royd. They wanted to teach him a lesson. They didn't like where he was going. They threatened him, asking him how he even dared to call the lady a witch. The Knights tauntingly suggested hitting him 100 more times. Perhaps then His Highness would forgive him. Back at his place, Glenn started picking out gifts for Vivian. He decided it would only be fresh flowers, yellow dahlias or freesias. He thought they would harmonize well with the girl's hair. The Archduke began to consult with his butler. Knowing that Vivian liked poetry collections and novels, he questioned whether giving only a book would be enough. From the book, he switched to a ring that was to be customized, or he wanted to give her a brooch or bracelet. He thought it was all nonsense, and the joy of such gifts would pass quickly. Among all the gifts, Glenn chose a dress, shoes, and a brooch. The butler gave the advice not to give shoes to the girl he loved, as she might run away after such a thing. The Archduke replied smugly that Vivian would never do such a thing, for she liked him too much. After arranging the gift, the butler said everything would be prepared. Glenn thanked him then, and after wishing each other good night, the servant left the room. On his way out, the butler thought as Glenn thanked him, "This is so unusual." It seemed to him the gentleman had grown up. Left alone, the Archduke drew from a locked desk drawer a book entitled Heir to a Great Empire, My Boyfriend. Notes of Vivi Rabbit, and started reading it. Glenn couldn't understand why Vivian hadn't classified the characters in the book. Didn't they usually take a pseudonym that didn't reveal the real identity in any way? He was curious if the day would come when he could read the book to her and how she would react to it. He had waited so long for this. His heart was about to jump out of his chest. Before meeting Vivian, it had been so emotionless that he had even doubted it existed. A few years ago, the ladies are having tea in the garden discussing books. On the table are 3 books by author Rabbit Vivi. Archduke, It's No Mistake, The Archduke Likes Rabbit, and Swordmaster Archduke. Maurice solemnly announced, Vivi the Rabbit is still with you. This time she bought 3 pieces, 1 to collect, 1 to read, and 1 to show off. The girls were amazed and giggled cutely. Maurice said she was here to show off Vivi's new bunny book, but she couldn't find it on the table. Picking up the book from the ground, the Archduke approached them. Opening the book, he asked, The heir to a great empire is my boyfriend, some kind of novel. The girls panicked, and he read a couple lines out loud. I have no one but you, and you're the only person I love, said Archduke Lennox in his beautiful voice. Glenn smiled at the lady and asked if someone would explain to him what it was. He thought it was a pointless love affair in which he was the protagonist. Does anyone imagine him to be like that? The Archduke understood nothing. Like he has a mountain of extra time for that kind of talk. In sparring with Lord Royd, Glenn asked Glenn what kind of man he saw him as. The one replied that he was by far the strongest swordsman. The Archduke emphasized that he was interested in personal qualities. Royd wondered in confusion why he was asking such a thing. Glenn thought, even the knight who admires him the most hasn't said anything similar, while the author wrote a whole shroud of text. The book did not come out of the Archduke's head. Sitting in the chair, he thought perhaps he should call an actor to read these naive lines with expression. He found it amusing. At this time, a servant stood before him, reading out the schedule: tomorrow an evening of dancing, next week a formal dinner at the Marquise Maurice's. Glenn wanted to know who Vivi the Rabbit was, even though he has no idea yet what to do after finding it. The handwriting is clearly not that of a commoner. It's like the kind aristocrats used to write with. At the ball, the ladies welcomed the Archduke. Glenn continued to speculate. Plus, this person is very familiar with high society and its culture, knows the rules of greeting and even the rules of seating. A young lady approached him, embarrassed to greet His Highness Lennox. She immediately ran away. The Archduke thought, this girl always does that. There was a simple conclusion to his reasoning. Vivi the Rabbit is from a noble family. The Archduke surveyed the ball and the dancing ladies. Assuming Vivi the Rabbit must be here. Perhaps it is the owner of that strange look he often feels on him. The look doesn't carry hate, but it is tense and annoying. The next morning, the Archduke saddled his horse. The knight stopped him, saying that the lord had been busy all the time and hadn't eaten anything since morning. He replied that he had some things to investigate on his own, ordering not to inform the servants. Glenn set off, thinking he couldn't say he was going in search of the man who had written a love affair featuring him. Listening to the conversations of passers-by, he had a clue. So she's using the bookworm store as a middleman. To the Archduke, his appearance seemed cute. It would probably be hard to fit even 2 people in it. You can't open the windows that easily, and you can't see anything because of the mud. There seems to be a print shop here as well, but it doesn't look like a place to make a quality book. Glenn was in his cloak, pulling the hood over his face. He was leafing through a book. The Archduke had no tongue to call this place a bookstore. However, if he was lucky, he might meet a rabbit here. That's when he'll catch her. A girl swept past him, asking him to step aside. She happily turned to the Archduke, thanking him for letting her pass. An awkward pause hung between them. Glenn was mesmerized by the young lady's beauty. He awkwardly covered his face with his book. Vivian apologized and left for her hostess. The girls greeted each other cheerfully. The bookstore owner emphasized how long it had been since Miss had been here. So many people are asking about Vivi the Rabbit's new job. So she kept trying to contact her. Vivian was happy to hear it, for she had just brought it. The Archduke, overhearing them, concluded that the girl was the Rabbit Vivi. As the hostess suddenly said, Vivian brings new works of the author every time. She is very grateful to her. The girl objected, saying she liked it herself. She asked for printing and binding. The shopkeeper gladly agreed and wished the girl a good journey. Glenn hesitated, she said, bringing a novel. She has well-groomed hair and skin, neat nails with a good manicure. The dress, though simple, is quite stylish. He had no doubt she was an aristocrat. A girl from a noble family walks unaccompanied. Glenn followed the girl into the shopping plaza. Vivian and the kids were looking at a huge apple. They were having fun together. The Archduke suggested that if she came across a criminal, it seemed to him she wasn't afraid of anything at all. The peddler was telling Glenn, who was holding the rabbit keychain, that this item sold well and was very well liked by children because of the shape of the rabbit. There were only a few left, he might as well get some. Suddenly it hit the Archduke. He had seen the girl's face somewhere before. He remembered the embarrassed girl from the ball, Earl Lewis's daughter, Vivian Lewis. After buying a rabbit from the merchant, he was looking at it, muttering her name, when suddenly it came to him that Vivi's rabbit was short for Vivian. She chose such an obvious pseudonym. It was too easy. The Archduke watched Vivian at the reception. He thought she was probably about to fall again. She's been caught 3 or 4 times in the past. Glenn assumed it was the shoes, but the lady was wearing boots. Even with her boots on, she somehow manages to fall. Seeing the Archduke, the girl rushed to escape. He sighed heavily. Vivian's downfall doesn't concern him. Though her novel about their relationship is quite cute on the surface, however, in terms of plot, the lovers are like kindergarten graduates. He wanted to look inside her head. The Archduke met the Marquise Maurice, and they greeted each other sweetly. While the lady spoke to him, the Archduke's attention was fixed on Vivian. He saw the girl picking up food from the table. He was puzzled by her behavior. Glenn wondered if she was starving at home. He had never heard of Earl Lewis bullying his children. Vivian ran off again. The Marquise coquettishly asked if the Archduke would like to dance with her daughter. The man apologized. He needed to leave immediately. Maurice sadly wished the Archduke would find another dance partner. The Archduke ran after Lady Vivian. He wondered where she was rushing off to, slipping all the time, and now she was flying at a breakneck pace. Glenn followed the girl into the imperial forest itself. He was worried about what would happen if the guards saw her. He was forced to go after her, for there are many wild animals there. Vivian crouched on the grass, holding out a bag of salad leaves and vegetables. The rabbits started running to her. The Archduke wondered if this was a help to a fellow man. The bunnies hopped next to Vivian, then climbed up her dress. One even licked her face. The girl laughed cutely. To Glenn, she seemed very nice. A rustling sound was heard. The Archduke turned around and saw the patrolmen. He rushed over to Vivian and hid them. The knights checked the place where he was and left, assuming they had imagined it. Vivian wondered. The Archduke, releasing the girl from his embrace, said whether she realized that she had infiltrated the Emperor's lands. She looked at him with her big lovely eyes and trembled. It was then that the Archduke first saw a man whose eyes exuded, "I like you," and the one to whom those feelings were directed was him. Glenn touched Vivian's face and immediately yanked his hand away. Blushing, the Archduke said it was time to return to the ballroom. Vivian agreed, wiping the tears from her face. The man stared at her, not understanding why his heart was beating so fast. He tried to pull himself together, after all. She's still a child. Accompanying the girl to the ballroom, Glenn led her gently, holding her hand. Vivian asked if the Archduke remembered her. The man said, "Young Miss Lewis, who always says hello and immediately runs away. Very sweet and friendly. That's how he remembered her." The girl blushed, hovering in the clouds. The Archduke reminded them that they needed to return to the ballroom. Vivian thanked her for her help. After wishing the Archduke a good evening, the girl ran off. Glenn clenched his hand into a fist, thinking, 5 years. In 5 years she will be 21 years old. The Archduke continued to make periodic visits to the city and keep an eye on Vivian. Glenn, sitting in his study, asks the butler if Earl Lewis has a formal reception. Butler replies that he's not sure about that. Maybe he should send a letter. The man answered in the negative, for it would be too obvious. He missed Vivian very much. All the last 5 years he had thought only of her. Sitting in the garden late at night, Glenn looked up into the beautiful starry sky. Hearing a rustle, he turned around and saw Vivian, wearing only a nightgown. He threw his jacket over her, wondering how she got through security. Every time a guest arrives at the mansion, the guards inform the butler and he informs the host. But no one had informed the Archduke of Vivian's arrival. The girl looked strange, looking closely into her eyes. The Archduke noticed traces of black magic. Vivian has absolutely no magic, so she definitely wouldn't be able to use it. Then someone else put this spell on her. Glenn wondered what kind of bastard dared to use black magic on his dear Vivian. If someone used a mind-directed spell, it could negatively affect her. The girl pressed herself against the Archduke's chest. Glenn became flustered and blushed. He looked at the lovely Vivian and tried to mentally reassure himself. First, we need to figure out what kind of magic this was. He lifted her face and took a closer look, figuring out it was a damn charm. Magic that allows you to summon an evil spirit that attacks a specific target. Glenn was quite certain that Crown Prince Arthur Asmode had done it. That bastard doesn't have the guts to challenge the Archduke openly. That's why he's always trying to hurt him discreetly. The Archduke was angry. He believed the prince would pay for using Vivian. The girl rushed to embrace the Archduke. She said she really liked him. Tears came to Vivian's eyes and she said she didn't want to get married. Glenn supposed there were quite a few families willing to marry their offspring to her. He wanted to deal with them later, but... The girl cried and said, "She will love the Archduke all her life." The Archduke asked if perhaps things were better left that way. Vivian screamed that she couldn't live her whole life alone just looking at him from afar. She needs to get married too. Whether she wants to or not, she has to do it. She began beating her fists on his chest, emphasizing that the Archduke was a fool. He wondered if Vivian wasn't under the effects of a cursed charm right now. The Archduke's eyes lit up, and he smiled embarrassedly. It is harmless in itself and cannot harm others. Therefore, darkness cannot penetrate it. Vivian kept nagging the Archduke, saying that she was annoyed by his smile. He was so handsome that it made her furious. She wanted to be the only one looking at this beauty, but the Archduke is too popular. Glenn suggested that Vivian could kidnap him, lock him up, and watch him. Vivian was encouraged by the idea. She clarified if it was really possible, and the Archduke allowed her to do as she wished. The girl rummaged in her pocket and pulled out a rope, wondering if he could be tied up. Glenn was surprised at the girl's preference, and silently held out his hands to her. Vivian began to fairly bundle them up. The Archduke thought he could easily break the rope. Vivian joyfully led the Archduke to her room, holding him by his rope. Glenn asked how she was going to kidnap him if even her alias was Rabbit. Vivian emphasized that she's not really a rabbit after all. The Archduke continued. Every time he came to the imperial palace, Vivian would run off to her brethren. Why not just have them at home? The girl replied that her mom doesn't like them, and also rabbits like to play in nature more. As they emerged from the bushes, a carriage was waiting for them on the road. Glenn wondered, there should be security here. Looking around, he saw the sleeping knights. Vivian couldn't turn them off with a stick or a fist. The man asked her what had happened. The girl cheerfully replied that she had given them candy. Glenn assumed it was magic candy with a sleeping effect. It was unlikely they would eat them on their own, so Vivian put it in their mouths. It made the Archduke angry, for he had not been fed by her in this way. The coachman rejoiced at Vivian's return. Then he saw the half-asleep Archduke, and he was shocked that he was traveling to visit them at night and in such a state. The knights awoke to the noise. The Archduke looked out of the wagon and ordered a quicker departure. From the window, he told his charges that he was being kidnapped, but there was no need to look for him. He would return. The knights protested. They did not understand what was happening and wished to save the Lord. The Archduke ran a finger near his neck, hinting that they would not live if they followed, and they went to Lewis County. The girl ran down the corridors, saying that the Archduke was now hers. Glenn confirmed her words. Reaching the door, she cheerfully announced that it was her room. The Archduke was agitated. Upon entering the room, he saw many portraits of him and a lot of other paraphernalia. This setting was extremely disconcerting. There's even a full-length pillow. The Archduke wondered if Vivian slept with her every night. He felt ashamed of his so frank thoughts and blushed. Vivian wondered what was wrong with him. Glenn broke the rope, grabbed Vivian in his arms, and carried her to the bed. He hugged her tightly, thinking how sweet she was. Glenn said he doesn't know what he'll do if this continues. The girl jumped up with an offer of help. She began to tie his hands again. There's nothing he can do now. Vivian praised the Archduke's indescribable beauty. She wanted to paint him. The Archduke was uncomfortable. He suggested that Vivian be patient for a while. The girl mumbled something, remembering how it was in that novel she had taken from Marina. Immediately, she ripped the Archduke's shirt off in shreds. Glenn cried out in a panic, questioning what kind of affair this was. Vivian sat down next to her, looking at the Archduke with a glowing look of happiness. Glenn said, embarrassed, if Vivian was so interested, she could touch it. The girl got excited and started touching the Archduke's stomach, emphasizing how firm it was, such pumped-up muscles. She decided to take that into account when she would draw. Vivian moved closer to the Archduke's face. His eyelashes seemed unusually beautiful to the girl. She asked if she could kiss him. The man faltered. He asked her to take her time, but Vivian was already reaching for him. They bumped foreheads, and Glenn said, afraid to upset her, that it wasn't a kiss. Vivian wondered, innocently asking then how it should be. The Archduke emphasized more gently, and she might try a light bite. Vivian resented it. If she bit him, the Archduke would be hurt. The man said what she was trying to do was more painful. After a little thought, Vivian bent toward the Archduke and kissed him on the lips. Glenn praised her, telling her that she had now done the right thing. Vivian was very embarrassed, hiding her face behind her hands. The Archduke laughed, asking if she wished to marry him. She got upset, saying how could she marry an Archduke? She can't marry an Archduke. Glenn regretted the question. He thought it would be best if Vivian woke up now. He wanted to see the real her, not an image conjured up by magic. I mean, he's been waiting 5 years for this. He was well aware of the difference in their situation, and did not want to give rise to rumors such as, a girl with whom the Archduke will play and throw away as an unnecessary toy. Vivian added that her father wouldn't agree to that. The Archduke holds too high a position. Vivian believed by marrying someone of her own level, one could live happily ever after. The man protested, saying it was her father's opinion but not his. He asked if she could be happy if she married another, for she liked the Archduke very much. Vivian cried. Glenn mentally berated himself for making her cry. The girl said affirmatively, Glenn Lennox is a fool. The Archduke glowered at Vivian, calling him by name. The girl started pounding Glenn, saying he didn't understand anything at all. Glenn laughed, emphasizing that he wasn't in any pain at all. To him, her blows are like the stabbing of a rabbit's foot. Vivian freaked out even more, saying she couldn't stand him. The Archduke smiled and, looking at the girl, said, but here he loves. She huffed, thinking that the Archduke loved himself no matter what. And Glenn clarified, he said he loved her, Vivian. This feeling no longer seemed to fit the definition of I like you. He confessed his love for her again. She couldn't believe it. Tears were coming to her eyes. Vivian was shaken, and she collapsed against the Archduke. Glenn considered that the effects of the magic were over. He breathed a sigh of relief. After all that had happened, Glenn rode home in the carriage and pondered the love contract. Even though it's childish, a love contract is also a relationship. Vivian was misled now, but he didn't plan on breaking up with her for anything in the world. Glenn was so lucky to catch her and will never let her go again. The knights rode in very much in suspense. The Archduke's smile seemed too happy to them. She gives them the creeps. The next morning, Vivian rubbed lovingly against her large pillow with the Archduke, thinking that the Archduke's smile, even in her sleep, was beautiful. All because of a goodnight kiss. At breakfast, the maid unobtrusively asked Vivian if she had stayed up late last night. The girl answered positively, thinking that she probably wanted to know what had happened during the night. Vivian remembered Casian's behavior, and her face looked like she was going to throw up. The maid was concerned about Mrs. Well-being. The girl replied that she was just dizzy from the sudden onslaught of memories. The maid patted her shoulder, telling her to be careful. She couldn't stand it, and still asked about last night. Is it true that the miss has been in communication with His Majesty the Archduke since last week? She knelt down in front of Vivian and grabbed her hands. The girl awkwardly replied, so she had heard it all before. The maid asked if she'd had any relationships before. She answered in the negative. The maid interrogated whether Miss understood what she meant by relationship. The girl laughed, saying a relationship is a relationship. How could it be otherwise? The maid emphasized that she was referring to a sexual relationship. Vivian hesitated, then blushed, shouting that they hadn't had any of that. Emma was very worried. The Archduke likes Miss so much that she is willing to give him all of herself. Vivian asked her not to worry so much. The girl laughed, saying even if she gave all of herself, it wouldn't do any good for the Archduke. The maid emphasized that Miss should remember, no matter how handsome and attractive the Archduke was, he should treat her well. She shouldn't trust him 100%. Emma sighed heavily for another long time and then left the room. After the day Vivian kidnapped the Archduke, Marina went to the library and found her bag open, as if someone had rummaged through it. This caused her to look up in surprise. Marina didn't think it looked like a thief. But then, what could have happened to her bag? Vivian receives gifts from the Archduke, flowers the shade of her hair, and a letter. She is thrilled that he wrote it personally and rushes to read it immediately. Jumping onto the bed, the girl rubs at the paper of the letter embarrassedly, smelling the Archduke's scent. She is delighted that Glenn has written her at least one letter. Vivian considers it, admiring the Archduke's beautiful handwriting. The girl tells the maid that she is about to melt with happiness. She awkwardly replies to her that it's a good thing. In the letter, the Archduke asks Vivian if she slept well, and if she liked his gifts. He confesses that he chose them thinking of her. He writes that he misses me and is coming over for dinner tonight. Vivian jumped up. She was very excited about the Archduke's offer to go on a date. The happy girl rushed to embrace her maid Emma. She exclaimed joyfully that she was going on a date with the Archduke. Vivian excitedly began jumping around the room and shouting out that she was going to have a date with Glenn. Emma warned her to be careful, miss. The maid told Vivian to calm down and open the gift at last, to which she received the girl's cheerful assent. Upon unwrapping the gift, the girl saw a beautiful dress. Emma said it was the first time she'd seen a dress with so much jewelry. Vivian examines the sparkling dress. She thinks the lace on it is a work of art. The maid asked the girl how the Archduke knew her size. There was an awkward pause, and Vivian interrupted her by suggesting that she open the next box of presents sooner rather than later. The unwrapping of presents was interrupted by a knock on the butler's door. He reported that the master was urgently summoning Lady Vivian to him. The girl was very surprised, as her father was very busy because of his work. She didn't understand the reason she had been summoned so suddenly. Vivian entered her father's room. On the couch in the room sat a man unfamiliar to her until that moment. The man stood up and introduced himself. It was Baron Evan Harries. The girl thought she had heard that name somewhere before. Vivian realized it was Mrs. Rockbell's cousin, the same Mrs. Mary Rockbell who runs the Lewis estate. She asked him what brought him here and if Mrs. Rockbell was okay. Hearing no reply, Vivian shifted her gaze to her father sitting across from her and the large suitcase that stood nearby. The girl's father was sitting in a chair at the end of the room. He was determined to have a serious conversation and motioned for her to sit down. Vivian learns from him that she is going on vacation today to recuperate, and Baron Harris must take care of her. This is very disturbing to the girl. She can't believe she is being sent on vacation while they have a date planned with Glenn. If she leaves, then the relationship with him will be temporarily terminated. Vivian asks her father not to send her on vacation, because then she will not be able to see the Archduke. Her father interrupts her begging. He asks the girl if she knows where that bead she broke came from. Vivian is puzzled. She doesn't understand how he knows about it. After all, she hasn't told anyone about it. Marina enters the room. She looks guilty, as if apologizing. Maybe it's the bead. Her father suggests that the girl sit down and tell Vivian all about that bag before it came to her at the academy. Marina sits down, takes a cup of tea, and begins to tell me that there is a strange Professor Shannon. He often glimpses in her surroundings. Crown Prince Asmod is very interested in magic, alchemy, soul art, and puppetry. He found talented people from all over the continent and brought them together. Keel Shannon became one of them. This Yanban has knowledge of black magic. He also received the Emperor's consent to practice it. After this story, an excited Vivian cautiously asks Marina what the bead was. Marina assumed it was some kind of trick. Most likely the bead had been made by him. Vivian admitted that as soon as she opened her bag, the bead exploded. A friend said that perhaps Shannon's magic was supposed to work not only after time, but when he came in contact with the balloon, after the explosion, all the things should have gone flying in different directions. The hidden balloon, according to his plan, would fall out, and the one who picked it up would be subjected to magic. Vivian assumed that the person the spell was intended for was Marina, not her. Then Marina told that earlier he offered her to study black magic, but she refused, and maybe because of this Professor Shannon wanted to take revenge on her. He had no problem straightening out those he didn't like, and tried to follow all of the Crown Prince's orders. Vivian now realized that everything had failed because she had taken the bead instead of her friend. And so the girl fell under the spell. Her friend winked at her and told her that Vivian was now like an heirloom, a one-of-a-kind specimen. Anyway, the bottom line is that the Crown Prince is behind it all. Father confirmed Marina's words. The Archduke and the Crown Prince did not initially have a good relationship. It wasn't clear if it was because of personal animosity or political strife. Vivian wanted to ask the Archduke about it later. Father asked Vivian if the Archduke expressed sympathy for her. Vivian tried to say something in favor of the Archduke, but her father interrupted her. The man said, "The Archduke is the most dangerous man he has ever seen." Vivian threw a shiver. She couldn't even contradict him. She liked the Archduke madly, but she had also heard of his notoriety. He was described as the youngest swordmaster and a catastrophic genius. He was insane and violent. The Count argued that it was quite possible that the Archduke pretended to be interested in Vivian. What he really wanted to find out was our relationship with the Crown Prince. The girl realized that the gifts and the letter sent this morning, and how thoughtful he had been yesterday, were all an act. Now it's clear, if you look at it from the Archduke's perspective, the easiest way to find out if Earl Lewis's family is related to the Crown Prince is to seduce her. Even if Glenn was deceiving Vivian, she still couldn't leave without saying goodbye. She didn't like that idea. The girl's father insisted that she leave as soon as possible before it was too late. He was worried that she had gotten into something dangerous. Vivian begs her father to say goodbye to the Archduke. She is confused and depressed. Tears ran down the girl's cheeks. With sadness and despair, she decides to write him a letter. In the letter, Vivian apologizes for this response to his letter. She asks to wait patiently until her family realizes that he is not involved. They're in a contractual relationship after all, even if it is a trap. The girl packed her things and went out into the courtyard, where her carriage and loved ones who had come to see her off were already waiting for her. Her brother Kasian hurried to say goodbye to Vivian. He called out to her loudly, asking her to stay a while. He was carrying something in his hand. Kasian ran up to his sister and grabbed her by the shoulders. She noticed the tears on his face. It made the girl puzzled. The boy held out his hand. In it was an amulet for Vivian. He wanted her to take it with her. She thanked him for that. Upset about what was happening, the brother expressed that this whole situation was due to the Lewis family's loss of influence. Vivian was outraged by this behavior of Kasian's. He shouldn't have spoken like that in front of his father. The girl tapped her brother with her hand and called him a scumbag. The lad resolutely promised his sister to regain the influence of the Lewis family and make sure no one else touched them. Vivian wished him luck. The brother flamed with confidence and anger, saying that those bastards wouldn't even lay a finger on her. The girl wondered if he was sane. Kasian turned and strode away, shouting after her that she didn't understand anything and let her think as she wished. Vivian didn't realize what she had done wrong. The coachman asked if they could depart. Vivian got into the wagon and they drove off. She was at a loss as to what to do about the oath. She asked God's forgiveness for breaking her vows. Vivian wished, may the Archduke live a prosperous life, free from turmoil and worry. Lennox possessions. The butler hands the young gentleman a letter, announcing that its sender is Miss Lewis. He grabbed the letter and immediately opened it, being very happy about receiving it. He thought how nice of Vivian. Even though they were meeting in the evening, apparently she couldn't wait. The Archduke began to read and his eyes rounded. Glenn crumpled up the letter, put on his jacket, and headed for the exit. The butler called out to His Highness. He turned around, and the butler was horrified. The Archduke's smile turned sinister. The Archduke said he was going to catch his runaway couple. The knights and butler present were very intimidated by such his smile. A heavy downpour has begun. The coachman yelled that the wheels were getting stuck. They'd better wait it out in a safe place. Vivian got off the wagon with Emma's help, asking her too to be careful. If it hadn't been for the downpour, they would have gotten there in 2 days. The attendants erected a tent under a tree. The girls were soaking wet and shivering from the cold. The coachman suggested the girls take a balloon. It would make them feel warmer. The man said that Earl Lewis had given it to them to take with them. Vivian assumed it was an expensive, disposable magic item. Her family isn't very wealthy, so finances must be tight. The girl's tears flowed, praying that her father, mother, and Kasian would be okay and that they wouldn't get sick. The rain was ending. Baron Harris asked if they wanted to eat something warm. Then their bodies will warm up too. The men built a fire, and together with Emma began to cook a meal. Vivian wondered if there was anything she could do to help. Watching the Baron cook, she marveled that he could do that too. Noticing her look, he asked if she needed anything. The girl waved in embarrassment that she didn't need anything. Emma and Harris laughed. The knight handed the miss a mug of hot tea. Vivian thanked and began to drink it. She wondered if the Archduke had received the letter. She hoped he would believe and understand her correctly. The man took off his helmet and asked if the food looked good. He praised himself, saying he clearly has an outstanding talent. Vivian was surprised to see the knight's face. She cried out, "It was him. He's that knight from the hunting competition." The knight confirmed her speculation, saying he was honored that Miss remembered it. "It's been 7 years since then," Vivian confirmed, emphasizing that she was 14 at the time. Vivian used to make jewelry, kike, and all aristocrats do to give to loved ones, but her skill wasn't enough, so she never got to give them to anyone. Then, at the competition, she struck up a conversation with this knight. He said since her jewelry didn't have an owner, maybe she could give it to him. He had heard that if one received such a gift, the competition would be successful. Vivian had believed his words then, but thinking about it now, he was just trying to comfort her. The knight called Miss out of her musings, saying that the meat was ready. Vivian began to eat. Her eyes glazed over. It was amazingly delicious. The attendants were very pleased that Miss enjoyed the food. They began to offer her more, roasted vegetables. There were potatoes here too. There was also chicken soup, beef sautéed with spices. Everything tasted good to Vivian, but she supposed she wasn't a hamster. They had half a day to go. They decided it would be best to spend the night at the hotel tonight. Vivian and her maid were settling down to sleep. Miss emphasized how much had happened today. Emma agreed, adding that traveling with Miss is fun. The girl thanked her for her words and saying goodnight went to bed. She hoped she was dreaming about the Archduke. Before she could think about it, she fell into a dream. In the morning, sitting in the dining room, Vivian was drinking tea when suddenly someone called out to her. Turning around, she saw her uncle. She was very surprised at this meeting and asked if he was passing through here. The man paused awkwardly for a moment, then said, "Even good for him. He'd like to introduce Vivian to someone." A man about her age appeared in front of them. His uncle introduced him as Viscount Alvin. Alvin was pleased to make the acquaintance, saying that Miss is as beautiful as they say she is. Uncle, against Vivian's will, seated them at the same table. The girl didn't like it very much, she thought. A noble lady traveling to a place where she can rest suddenly finds herself on the lookout. Her father would never have allowed such an absurd situation. Vivian concluded, so it was her uncle's initiative. The man said this was their first meeting. His name is Scott Alvin. Vivian thought, holding a viewing party at an inn like this man is clearly out of his mind. She awkwardly introduced herself. Scott winked at the girl, telling her she didn't need to worry so much. Vivian figured she wasn't worried, she just didn't like him. The man asked if he could call her Vivian, or perhaps some other affectionate nickname. He started throwing around options, Vivi, Viv, Anna, asking which one she liked. This made Vivian very angry, and she replied, barely restraining herself, that she would use a name or nickname the first time she met him. He interrupted her, saying that for convenience, Miss could call him Scott. The Viscount began to tell Vivian that not too long ago, a gold mine was found on his estate, so he's a little rich. Vivian thought from the first meeting he was bragging about money. Sure, her family has lost their wealth, but doesn't her uncle think it's too much? Uncle was sitting nearby, obviously pretending he wasn't overhearing anything. She'd known her uncle since he'd blown his entire fortune on gambling. Scott continued, saying that Vivian would benefit greatly from marrying him. He emphasized, for sure Miss wants to wear not old but gorgeous and elegant dresses. It was evident that in a poor house Miss could not properly reveal herself, but if she married him, Vivian jumped up and, striking her hands on the table, ordered him to stop. She could listen to it no longer. In a rage, Vivian poured a glass of water on the Baron. She said Earl Lewis's family is not rich, but not rich enough to beg something from a man like him. She thought it was her uncle who was going to ask him for money. Pointing in his direction, she yelled out what kind of gambling he'd blown his money on this time. The man jumped up. He wanted to object, but Vivian didn't let a word out. She asked him if it wasn't too much to sell his niece to make money. Uncle thought Vivian was talking nonsense. The Baron was angered by her speech and swung his hand at her. Vivian screamed, covering her face. There was no impact. Opening her eyes, she saw the Archduke holding the Baron by the neck. The knights rushed to their aid.